How about now? Does that work? Testing. All right, everybody. Welcome to the Bald Eagle podcast. Hopefully you guys can hear me. I'm having some technical issues that I have no idea why. Everything is connected the way that I always connect it. But anyway, here I am, the Bald Eagle podcast. This is a 100% Philadelphia Eagles podcast. Thanks for listening. Thanks for tuning in. It is Wednesday, February 17th. We don't have the normal exciting countdowns to talk about as far as games or any of that stuff, but we have a countdown going on. But before I do that, I want to go over my 3 rules, because that's one of the things that is most important to me is the 3 rules, and it's specifically because I like this to be an escape for everybody. If you're sick, which I am, of politics or other things out there that are bothering you, this is strictly about football. So that's rule number 1: no politics. Rule number 2: we don't talk about personal information. So I'm not going to tell you what the players did on their vacations or any of that stuff. Just going to talk strictly about football and only the things that affect the game. All right. And then I'm not censored, so this isn't a kid's show necessarily. So I mentioned the countdown. So we don't have a game to count down to. So we're going to count down to the beginning of the window for NFL teams to designate players as franchise tag or transition tag. So that begins in 6 days. That begins on the 23rd, and it lasts until 4 p.m. on March 9th. So from February 23rd, there wasn't a time for that, until March 9th, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. All teams can designate players as either a franchise tag or a transition tag. Now, I haven't read anything that says that you can possibly do both. There was a period recently where you could name both a franchise and a transition tag player, and that was allowed in the last year of the former collective bargaining agreement, which was redone in prior to last season, and a lot of it didn't go in effect because of the virus. But one of the things that was allowed was you were allowed to carry both a franchise tag and a transition tag. So I'm aware of what a franchise tag is, but I figured I'd do some research and help out those that didn't. And of course, I learned some things in the process. Number 1, the franchise tag has only been around since 1993. So something that was created. I mentioned earlier, each team can designate technically one player with a franchise or the transition tag. I mentioned it was increased to both for 1 year, but I think generally speaking, you can only do one. Now, the franchise tag is the one that's the most common, the most popular, the ones we always hear about. There's two types of it. One is much more common than the other, and when I explain the differences, you'll probably understand why. The exclusive franchise tag, which is one of them, not the more popular one, but is one of them. If you tag a player as your exclusive franchise tag, you have to offer them a 1-year contract. The salary that you offer has to be the greater of the average top 5 salaries at that specific position in the previous year, or 120% of the player's previous year's salary, whichever is greater. So, if you have a highly paid in relation to their peers at their position, you might have to throw out that 120% versus the average. Now, in an exclusive franchise tag, the player has no rights. He cannot negotiate with other teams. He can't do anything. He's stuck with the team that tug him. The team, on the other hand, can still shop around and possibly trade him. The most common franchise tag is what they call a non-exclusive franchise tag, and you'll understand why once I go over the details of it, why it's the most common. But now, I was under the impression that the franchise tags, both exclusive and non-exclusive, I didn't know there was a difference. I thought they were always an average of your salary, of your position salary of the previous year, the top 5, right? According to Wikipedia, and I was not able to verify this anywhere else, so take that for what it's worth, the non-exclusive, still a 1-year contract. Franchise and transition tags are always 1-year contracts, except this one says it was the salary, the greater of the salary of the top 5 cap hits for the player's position over the last 5 years. I thought it was just the most recent year. That's new to me, but that's what Wikipedia said, and I couldn't find, all the other articles that I read about franchise tags, just kind of lumped them together and didn't mention that difference. So I don't know if that's a legitimate difference or not. Either way, if you want to franchise tag a player, either at exclusive or non-exclusive, you can only give him a 1-year contract, and you have to pay him, more than the 5 top players in his position. Now, with the non-exclusive tag, which again is the most common, the players can negotiate with other teams. They're still free to move around and discuss negotiations. If another team makes a competing offer, and a competing offer has to, of course, beat that tag or be better than that tag in some capacity, the team that has tagged the player can match that offer. So they have the ability to match it. If they don't match it, if it exceeds their tag and they don't match it, the player can move teams, get the better salary. However, the team that the player's leaving gets 2 first-round draft picks. So they basically made this non-exclusive franchise tag really hurt if you offer a franchise tag, if you steal a franchise tag player, because who would want to give up 2 first-round draft picks? And frankly, I would imagine there's only a handful of players out there that would even be worth 2 first-round draft picks. And not to cut to later in the podcast, but Carson Wentz isn't one of those. Anyway, so both tags, exclusive, non-exclusive. Non-exclusive is the most common, probably what we always hear about. There is also what they call a transition tag. I don't think this is used very often. Perhaps it was used this year when you could do both. I got some comments here. Yeah, Eric and Ryan are asking who's worth a tag. You're jumping ahead. You guys are jumping ahead. I don't think anybody is. I don't think anybody's worth using the franchise tag on. And historically, the Eagles have not used it very often. They've used it, and I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but I think 5 times since 1993, they used the franchise tag 5 times. So a transition tag, not very common. It's still out there, but you have to offer a 1-year contract. The difference is you have to give the greater of the top 10 salaries, or 120% of their previous year's salary. You have 7 days to match an offer if someone makes an offer to your transition tagged player, and then if they don't match the offer, you lose the player. There's no compensation. So transition tag doesn't really do anything but force you to give them a better contract. Now, the tag estimates are based on salary caps. So the salary cap is supposed to be between 180 and 181 million dollars this year. So based on according to Pro Football Focus, based on an average cap of 180.5 million dollars. Of course, the top position, if you wanted to tag a quarterback, you'd have to give them roughly $24.8 million for that 1 year. I don't know of a quarterback that would be available that'd be worth $24 million in 1 year, off the top of my head. Anywhere. Second most valuable position, defensive end, $15.89 million would be the tag. Third is wide receiver, $15.80 million, so slightly under defensive end. Quarterbacks are able to grab $14.89 million. Linebackers, $14.63. Defensive tackles, $13.73. Offensive linemen, $13.6. So, of course, we have the high one at quarterback. They're always paid the most. But then we have a pretty big, between 13 and 15 million, give or take. We have the majority of the players, defensive ends, wide receivers, corners, linebackers, defensive tackles, and offensive linemen. Even safeties, which is next, get 10.5, 10.49 as a salary player or as a tagged player. But then we're under 10 million. The two lowest average positions, skilled positions, and skilled positions are the receivers, not the linemen, are tight ends, which is the cap is 9.49. And running backs, 8.561. So gives you an idea of the value that these teams are putting on specific players, because that's an average of the top salaries. So running backs are still, and this is something that was talked about a while back, running backs still are not getting apparently those huge contracts, as the tag on those is $8.5 million. I'd love to have 1 year of that tag. I'd love to have a month of that tag, but much less than most. And then last, appropriately, the punters and kickers, if they franchise tag them, which I don't know if that's ever happened. I should look that up. $4.4 million. All right. So I mentioned that the Eagles, Ryan and Eric asked me through the comments if we're going to use our tags and who's worth a tag. The answer is no. I don't think we'll use either of our tags, and that's because I don't think anybody's worth it. I mentioned we've used our tag, or the Eagles have used their tag 5 times since 1993. The first time we used it was for Jeremiah Trotter in 2002. You guys might remember him. He had I don't recall, I think he had a Pro Bowl year, wanted a longer contract. We tagged him and then eventually let him go to Washington the same year. So the tag really was, we let him go. We didn't get the 2 first-round draft picks from Washington. But he had a horrible 2-3 seasons at Washington, came back, resurrected his career in Philadelphia again. So we used it again for Corey Simon in 2005. In 2008, we used the tag for L.J. Smith, who was a tight end that, according to my research, Donovan McNabb was a huge fan of. So he pushed the tag for L.J. Smith, turned out to be a flop. We did use it for Michael Vick, 2011. And most recently, we used it for Deshaun Jackson in 2012. I don't see that, again, for the 5th time, I don't think we're going to use it this year, so I don't see us adding to that list of 5. Now, I did our countdown on the most recent NFL date, the window where you can franchise tag people. But there are a bunch of other dates coming up I figured I'd share with you. March 17th at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time is the beginning of the 2021-2022 league year. So that's officially the beginning of the year. It's also when free agency starts. So that's a big date coming up. Free agency starts on March 17th. April 5th, if you hired a new head coach after the regular season, 2020 regular season, like the Eagles did, you can begin your off-season workout programs on April 5th. For those clubs that have a head coach that's returning, that was a head coach last year, they start off-season workout programs April 19th. April 23rd is the deadline for restricted free agents to sign offer sheets. April 28th is the last day for clubs to match those offer sheets for those restricted free agents. And from April 29th to May 1st is the 2021 NFL Draft, and it's going to be held in Cleveland, Ohio. Now, some of these dates, specifically the times when clubs can go to their off-season workout programs and things, the specific ones about practice, while they're on the calendar, there has been discussion about about training camp and preseason being very similar to what it was this past year due to COVID. I have not seen any specifics, but there was a note that said that it would be this preseason may be very similar to 2020's. So cross our fingers and hope that that's incorrect, but that's what I've heard. The other thing that most of you might be wondering about, maybe not, is the NFL Combine. Not something you can generally get to or go to, but most people probably watched it. It's a good way to get stats on your players, consistent stats. They run all the same drills generally. Unfortunately, there's going to be no Combine. Generally, it's held the last week of February, so it would be coming up in the next week or two. But according to an NFL memo, and I quote, "There will be no in-person workouts at the Combine. Instead, any workouts will take place on the individual pro days on college campuses. We will work with the schools to encourage consistency in testing and drills across pro days and ensure that all clubs have access to video from those workouts, irrespective of whether the club is represented at a particular workout or not. Rules governing timing and testing of draft-eligible players with club personnel attendance at pro days will be sent in separate player personnel memorandum." So they're relying on college pro days to get all their scouting information. No Combine. All right, so let's move to some news. We've all probably read about the full coaching staff for the Eagles, so I'm going to go over it real quick. There was a handful of players or people that were added over the last week or two. I unfortunately wasn't able to have a show a week ago. I didn't get to recap the Super Bowl, which was a bummer for me, but I thought it was probably too far off. But maybe we'll do it in a future episode when I run out of stuff to talk to. But so over the last few weeks, we've added a couple of people to the staff. So the staff is apparently finished, and that includes, as we know, head coach Nick Sirianni, defensive coordinator Jonathan Gannon, defensive line coach Tracy Rocker, pass game coordinator Kevin Patullo, offensive coordinator Shane Steichen, tight end coach Jason Michael, quarterbacks coach Brian Johnson, offensive line coach Jeff Stoutman, linebackers coach Nick Rallis, special teams coach Michael Clay, defensive back coach Denard Wilson, wide receivers coach Aaron Moorhead, assistant defensive back coach Jay Valai, and then some people that were added. Jamal Singleton, he is the new running backs / assistant head coach. Jamal played 3 years as a running back for the Air Force, averaging 5.4 yards per carry. Didn't run for, I think his whole career he ran for 1,000 yards. So not a number one back, but 5.4 yards a carry is not bad. The first 7 years that he was coaching, he spent that at his alma mater, the Air Force. Initially, he was a prep assistant. In 2003, he was promoted to the varsity assistant coach. And then in 2006, he was promoted to the running backs coach for the Air Force. So he was there for 7 years, from 2003 to 2011. Between 2011 until he was hired a few weeks ago by the Eagles, he was essentially a running back coach for a bunch of teams in college and professionally. In college, he was running back coach for Oklahoma State, Arkansas, and then in the NFL, he was running backs coach for the Colts, Raiders, and Bengals. One of the things that I noticed was while he was with the Colts, which is also probably the time he ran into Sirianni, but while he was with the Colts, he coached Frank Gore for 2 seasons. In those 2 seasons, he was ranked 9th in rushing yards. He ran for 1,000 yards his 9th time. He was the first Colt to run over 1,000 yards since Joseph Adai, who did it 9 years earlier. So the Colts went 9 years without having a 1,000-yard rusher. And he was the 4th player over 33 or over to run for 1,000 yards in a season. So, and the last time somebody did that was John Riggins in 1984. So there hasn't been a running back 33 or over that's run for 1,000 yards in 37 years. So he's our new running backs assistant head coach. We brought in a new special teams quality control coach. His name is Tyler Brown. He was formerly a special teams analyst and graduate assistant at the University of Michigan. We also hired a defensive quality control coach, Joe Casper. Joe Casper has a pretty long history of, he's been coaching since 2013. He started with the Cleveland Browns as player personnel and development assistant. He moved then, he did that from 2013 to 2015. He then moved to Mentor High School, where he was a defensive back coach for one season, 2015, 2016. And then he went to John Carroll University as the wide receivers coach in 2017. And then from 2018 until we hired him, he was a graduate assistant coach, primarily working with defensive backs at Duke. So we have an offensive quality control coach in Alex Tanney. Alex Tanney played 4 years at Monmouth and ended his college career with 157 touchdown passes, most in NCAA history, and the second most passing yards in NCAA Division III history with 14,249 yards. Undrafted free agent, but he did end up playing 9 years in the NFL. During his 9-year career, he threw 15 passes. He completed 11 of those for 100 yards and 1 touchdown. And he was with a bunch of teams over his 9-year career, starting off with KC, Kansas City. And he went to the Cowgirls, then to the Browns, Buccaneers. He was with the Titans. He was at Buffalo, Indianapolis, and then the Giants. He was actually with the Titans, I think, after Buffalo as well. So he was with them twice. But most recently with the New York Giants. He played 2 years with the Giants and recently retired and then moved to our offensive quality control coach. We hired another coach's assistant in Tyler Scudder. He was the senior defensive quality control coach for Iowa State for the past 3 years. And we also hired a new head strength and conditioning coach in Fernando Noriega, who, by the way, there is an actor named Fernando Noriega. A lot of Fernando Noriegas out there. But he was the Rams strength assistant for the last 3 years, from 2017 to 2020. So he got promoted to head strength and conditioning. I read a note that in 2017, his first year as strength assistant, the Rams were rated the most healthiest team. I don't know what the metric was on that, but they were rated healthiest team in 2017. So I pray that he can bring some of that to our team. All right, let's talk about roster moves. Not a lot to talk about here, of course, but it is the first move by our new coaching staff, by Nick Sirianni's new staff. We claimed corner Shaquille Taylor off of waivers, again from the Giants. He is 6 feet, 181 pounds. He runs the 40 in 4.42 seconds, and he has a 37-inch vertical. His career has kind of been impacted by injuries, and I don't know that I would say he's injury prone necessarily, but I would say that injuries have possibly held him back. So, for example, while he was at Kansas, he had a season-ending injury in his junior year, right? So he missed. I think he played 5 or 6 games before he got injured. During his pro day, he had a shoulder injury, so he didn't bench press. Not that that's a big deal, but it still prevented him from doing some of that stuff. And he was in Indianapolis. But they initially, and apparently he had a great preseason and training camp in 2019 for the Colts, but he had a concussion, and they waived him due to that concussion. Now I guess he took an injury settlement, and then so after that settlement he couldn't play for the team for a while, and then they re-signed him later. In his senior year at Kansas, he had 47 tackles, 3 picks, one of them a pick 6. 7 passes defensed and 2 forced fumbles. So not bad for 1 year at Kansas. I mentioned he was signed initially by the Colts as an undrafted free agent. He was waived after the preseason because of a concussion, and then he re-signed later, and that's when he made his NFL debut on October 6, 2019. But he was waived soon after there in November of 2019. He was then signed and then waived by the Broncos, signed to the Giants, but he was actually signed to the Giants last year, but decided to opt out. It says due to severe asthma and family members passing away, so he might have severe asthma, and I'm assuming that other family members were ill, and he was concerned that they would pass away. So he was what they consider a high-risk opt-out, which means he got a higher salary as compared to a low-risk opt-out, somebody that may not have medical conditions. Or family members that have medical conditions. So, but he will be back and at least in training camp this year. So, a decent pickup in a place where we need help. So, who knows what we can turn out to be. All right, some trade rumors going on. According to now, when we talk about trade rumors, I mean, really the only one, the biggest one that everybody's talking about, and everybody keeps saying it's about to happen. It's about to happen. Carson Wentz is going somewhere. Bears, Colts, first round and a late round, 2 second. I don't know. So I've heard some things. I'm gonna share them with you. I don't like to get too far into these rumors because they are just that. They're rumors, and we could go through rumors all off season, and Carson Wentz could end up an Eagle next year. So it could all be pointless. But there is a huge amount of people that are saying that the Eagles are getting rid of Carson Wentz. The Bears and the Colts were the two top teams. The things that I'm hearing, the stuff that I'm hearing that gets me excited is that it's possible that we could get a first round draft pick and then a late round draft pick for Carson Wentz, and I think that would be a win, a huge win. I think that a first round draft pick for Carson would give us 2, and a late round pick would just give us an extra pick to play around with in the draft. And I don't know that he's worth much more than that. And I don't know. Now, okay, let me talk about what I've heard, and then we'll kind of go down that road. So a gentleman by the name of Dan Saleo, former NFL player, brags on his Twitter about calling some other things. Is claiming probably the same thing that I guess most people are, is that the Eagles and Colts are wrapping up on the Carson Wentz deal. So apparently they're wrapping up. It's getting close. However, Ron Jaworski, and who has more inside information, I mean, I guess Jaws probably, but according to Ron Jaworski, and I quote, the Colts have offered 2 second-round picks, maybe a third or fourth down the road, and that appears to be the best offer I have heard. Now, that the less exciting 2 second-round picks makes a lot more sense to me. And initially, I thought, well, it's because even everybody in the NFL knows that Carson Wentz isn't worth that much. However, it might not, and that would be my initial reaction, and that's why I wouldn't give up a first round pick for Carson Wentz. However, it could be that the other teams know how desperate that the Eagles are, or hopeful that the Eagles are to get rid of Wentz and the cap hit. So it could be that these other teams are intentionally undercutting what he might be able to get in a normal environment, because they know that the Eagles have a huge cap hit, and by not, the Colts, let's say that they are entertaining a trade or they're close to a deal, part of their decision, I would think, and it wouldn't be as significant as if they were in our division or any of that stuff, but part of the decision is giving up whatever they give up for Carson Wentz. Say it's a first and a third. Is that worth the risk that Carson Wentz presents? And is that worth alleviating that huge hit to the cap for the Eagles? Because you're not really, you're not necessarily helping them, but you're not, you are, in so many, in so much of an aspect. So the Chicago Bears, do they believe that much in Wentz that they think that that he's worth whatever the picks they're giving up, and can turn their team around, and will allow the Eagles to become a better team because now they have cap space to move around? I don't know. I initially thought it was all because Carson Wentz isn't worth it, but it could just be because everybody knows the Eagles are in trouble if they don't get rid of him. There's also rumors, according to Adam Schefter, that if Wentz is traded, the Eagles are going to look to add another quarterback through the draft or free agency. If we add another quarterback through free agency, I'm okay with that. If we draft another quarterback in round 3 or sooner, I think I would be really upset. I think that would be a horrible decision. I think, he didn't get a lot of time playing, but Jalen Hurts, if you want to talk about characteristics that go along with elite quarterbacks, he flashed a lot of them: pocket presence, anticipating throws, throwing receivers open. He while he wasn't consistent with his accuracy necessarily, he did have moments where he threw some deep balls very accurately. I mean, he just showed some flashes of some really good play, and so I feel comfortable. I know this means a lot to everybody, including the Eagles organization, but I feel comfortable with Jalen Hurts being our starter. I guess I can understand some concern if our backup is Sudfeld, even though the organization really got behind him when we put him in against the Giants. I'm sorry, we put him in to cause the Giants to not make the playoffs. But I don't know that I'm comfortable with him being number 2. So that's why I'm okay with a 4th, 5th round quarterback if we're going to go searching. for a project, or maybe a free agent, some guy who's been around that that will come in and play a handful of games that has some experience. But I certainly hope we do not waste any of our higher picks, even through the third round. I think we got to go fourth or later on a quarterback. I think it could very well have been the reason that Wentz did so poorly last year. Not that that's an excuse; he should have still done well, but it could have been the catalyst to all that. And I don't want to go play around with any of that stuff. I think Hurts. We give Hurts a good shot here. I've also heard that the Eagles are expected to make a big push for Marlon Mack. He's a running back, free agent from the Colts, so makes sense since a good portion of our staff has had experience with the Colts and most recently. So that's a lot of the rumors. Now, don't have any comments. I don't know if anybody's heard anything else, but I'm okay with a first and a late round. 2 second-round picks. I'm not sure. I mean, 2 second-round picks I'd be okay with. I wouldn't be ecstatic. I wouldn't run for it. I guess I'd be doing what the Eagles are doing if that's what the Colts have offered. I'd be, trying to find a better offer, at least try and get one first-rounder. But I'd be okay with 2 second-round picks. All right, not a lot to talk about. We're getting near the end here, so I like to do an Eagles fact. I like to share do some research on something about the Eagles that maybe most people don't know. This time I would, and if you follow, hopefully you've listened to all my podcasts, right? So if you have, we've gone over the first 4 years that the Eagles were in the NFL. So we're going to start with, we're going to go into the 5th year in the Eagles that were part of the NFL. Remember that they weren't able to be in the NFL for a while because I don't know if it was the state of Pennsylvania, because both the Pittsburgh Steelers, they were called that, and the Eagles, Pittsburgh Pirates, and the Eagles were not allowed to be part of the league because Pennsylvania had laws that prohibited competitive or professional sports on Sundays. So they weren't able to be in the NFL. It's an inception. They had to wait. They joined, and their 5th year was in 1937. In 1937, the head coach was Burt Bell. We played in what was at the time called the Philadelphia Municipal Stadium. The Eagles only played there for 3 years, from 1936 to 1939. I looked at in 1937, we averaged 4,620 fans at our home games. Now, I don't know how much the stadium could seat in 1937, but online, if you look it up, it said that it had, for the majority of its life, it could hold 102,000 fans. Now, I'm sure when it was built in 20 something, there's no way I can't imagine they seated it for 102,000 fans. In the 1920s, I can't imagine. There's probably 102,000 people in New York, but I don't know. I don't know how many people were around and how many football was, especially professional football, was still kind of getting going. So not a lot of fans. Now we did. That stadium was actually, if you guys are going to do research, was renamed the John F. Kennedy Stadium in 1964, and it doesn't exist anymore. It was demolished in 1982, and it was on the footprint that is currently where the Philadelphia sports area is, with all the different arenas and stadiums and all that stuff. In 1937, the Eagles held training camp at Temple University. Back then, passing was not a significant part of the game, and it wasn't nearly as efficient as it is now. In 1937, the Philadelphia Eagles had 2 players that were the lead passers and the lead rushers, and they essentially had split it, not necessarily 50-50, but 55-45. They didn't actually have, from what I can gather here, they didn't have an official quarterback position in 1937. So we had a fullback and a tailback. Our fullback was Dave Smuckler, and our tailback was Emmett Mortell. So between the two of them, they were essentially they threw and ran the ball. Between the two of them, they completed 63 of their 207 passes. So they completed 30.4% of their passes, which would be, that is awful in the NFL. The whole season they threw for 849 yards. They had 8 touchdowns and they had 24 interceptions. And if you add all that up in a current quarterback rating, which isn't really fair because obviously the game was played differently back then, but if you put all that stuff into a calculator for a quarterback rating, that would equal a 17.83 quarterback rating, which is awful. Their passing game was ranked 8th out of 10 teams. Back in 1937, there was only 10 teams in the NFL. In addition, the NFL was I don't know how much of a competition it was, but the NFL was also competing with two other leagues in 1937. The AFL, which we know merged with the NFL 30-some years later. There was another team, the Affiliated American Football League, perhaps. They had some teams too, but they weren't real competitive. AFL, I don't even think was real competitive back then. So out of the 10 teams in the NFL, our passing game was ranked 8th, so second last. To give you some perspective, because I mentioned that some of those stats and they sound horrible, but let's compare them to other teams in the league, and they won't seem so bad after this. So the top passing team in 1937 in the NFL was the Green Bay Packers. They were the best top passing team in the league, and as a team, they completed 95 passes out of 216 attempts, so that's 44%. They had 1,398 yards. They passed for 16 touchdowns, but they also threw 26 interceptions. So their quarterback rating, again, based on current metrics or the current calculation, is 50.81. Much better than the 17, but still, with those numbers, you would never make it as a quarterback in the NFL. I don't think you'd never make it in college, high school. If you threw 16 touchdowns and 26 interceptions, I don't think you'd make it anywhere. I don't even think you'd make it on a backyard team. But that gives you some perspective that even though we only completed 30% of our passes and threw all those interceptions, and we were ranked second last out of 10 teams, in comparison, it wasn't that far off. In 1937, the NFL passing leader was a gentleman by the name of Slingin' Sammy Baugh. He threw 171 passes and completed 81 of those. That's 47.4%. There was another quarterback who had a higher completion percentage, but it was I don't believe it was even at 48. I think it was 47.6 or so that was the highest completion percentage in the NFL in that year. 47. They completed less than half of their passes. Again, Sammy Baugh was the leading passer. He had 1,127 yards, and he threw for 8 touchdowns and 14 interceptions. I didn't look up what his quarterback rating would be. We put it into a calculator now. Let's see. So I said he had 171 attempts, completed 81 of them. He threw for 1,127 yards, 8 touchdowns, and 14 interceptions. Sammy Baugh's passer rating in 1937, when he led the league in passing, was 50.5. So not nearly as efficient as they are now. They don't pass nearly as often. I looked through the list of quarterbacks in 1937. I don't believe there was a single one who had more touchdowns than interceptions. So just some pretty rough, I guess the beginning of the modern passing game. I mentioned that David Smuckler, our fullback, and Emmett Martell, our tailback, were our leading passers. They were also our leading rushers. Nothing to brag about because as a team, we ranked last in the NFL, 10 out of 10 in rushing. Emmett Martell had 100 rushes for 312 yards. That's a 3.1 average, poor in current standards. Dave Smuckler had 92 rushes for 247 yards. That's a 2.7 average. He also had 1 touchdown, but that also is poor in current standards. Dave Smuckler, in addition to being half our quarterback, half our running back, was also our kicker. He kicked extra points and I think 1 field goal in 1937. To give some comparison to our team as how we rushed and the rest of the league, the Detroit Lions were the top rushing team in the NFL in 1937 with 484 rushes for 2,074 yards and 12 touchdowns. So that is they averaged 188.5 yards per game rushing, which was by far the most. And if any team, I didn't look at the rankings. What team? Let's look at this to give you some more perspective. So back in 1937, the Detroit Lions averaged 188.5 yards per game rushing. Let's look at what it was. Rushing yards per game. Baltimore. The Baltimore, pretty obvious, Baltimore Ravens. But the Baltimore Ravens, who we all probably recognize as one of the heaviest rush teams probably in a while. Baltimore runs the ball probably more often than most teams, and probably more often than most teams historically. I don't have time to look that up while I'm talking, but the Baltimore Ravens in the last season averaged 192.1 rushing yards per game. The 1937 Detroit Lions averaged 188.5. So now the Detroit Lions didn't do very well that year. So of course, even though they blew everybody out with rushing yards, they still didn't make it to the playoffs. But just to give you some perspective, the leading rusher in the NFL was a gentleman by the name of Cliff Battles. He had 216 rushes for 874 yards. That's a 4-yard per carry average, which is good. And he had 5 touchdowns. So that actually is, it's not a great year. He didn't get 1,000 yards, but in 10 games, that's pretty good. If you extend that another 6, he easily hits 1,000, and maybe even close to 12 or 13. So not bad. Our top receiver was actually a right end. I think a lot of time, I don't think they had officially wide receivers. They had ends that would block and sometimes go out in patterns. For the full year, 1937, our top receiver had 15 receptions for 282 yards and 3 touchdowns. That's a really good game right now in the NFL. 282 yards might be a little bit high. 15 receptions, though, is not unreasonable. That year, the top receiver in the NFL was Gaynell Tinsley, and he had 675 yards. Again, we're talking about 10 games, so not so bad. Our final record was 2-8-1. There was 11 games in a season. It's 2-8-1. We had 1 tie. We actually started the year 0-4-1, which sounds pretty familiar. But we did our first win did come against the Washington Redskins, who the Washington Redskins had the second best record in the league that year. They led our division, and they played the Chicago Bears, who had the best record in the NFL that year, in the championship game. And they beat the Chicago Bears. So we were able to beat the Washington Redskins in the 6th game that we played. We beat them, and the Washington Redskins eventually won the championship against the Bears 28-21. We beat them 14-0, which I think back then is, it's not, you didn't crush them, but it's a pretty significant win when you look at the amount of points that they scored in games. We beat the championship team 14-0. So kind of surprising. I don't know. I didn't see any notes if anybody was injured or didn't play or whatever. But so with that record of 2-8-1, we did not make the playoffs. And in our 5th year in the NFL, we failed to make the playoffs for the 5th consecutive time. So we had and I've heard about this. I wasn't around, of course, to see it or to experience it. But I've heard that the beginning of our when we first joined the NFL, we were one of the worst teams. So I guess we're going to have to get used to this while I count up the years. All right, that does it for the Bald Eagle podcast. Please follow me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. I am Bald Eagle 4133. If you look for me on YouTube, you have to type in the Bald Eagle podcast, and you'll find out all my old podcasts. I'll upload this one shortly as well. And please follow Notoriety Sports Network. They are the parent to NSN Philly, who I am a part of as far as my podcast. So follow Notoriety Sports Network on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Follow NSN Philly on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. They're your number one source for breaking news, trade alerts, anything to do with sports. And Notoriety Sports is the broad network. NSN Philly, which I'm a part of, is specifically Philly sports. I cover the Philadelphia Eagles. We have other podcasts throughout the week that cover the Eagles. I think we have people that cover the Flyers, the Sixers, the Phillies. We have it all covered. So check us out on social media, and like, watch, follow, forward, do whatever you want on social media to get us as far as we can. So thanks for listening, and go Eagles.